Here we go. Chapter 17 in the Great Airport Mystery. A revealing list. Tense and excited, Frank and Joe watched the cabin door. Suddenly it swung open, then slammed shut again. During the next few moments, this cycle was repeated several times. "What's going on?" Joe whispered. Frank glanced at the surrounding trees. He noticed that the leaves were moving and grinned. "It's the wind," he said. "The door's being blown open and shut. It must have a faulty latch." The boys studied the cabin for a sign somebody was around. When they were fairly certain that no one was nearby, they stepped from behind the cover of the tree. "I'm going into the cabin," Frank announced. "You stay on guard here." "Be careful," Joe urged. "If you need help, just yell." Frank slowly approached the cabin. The door swung open and was about to slam shut again when the young sleuth grabbed the knob. Stealthily, he poked his head inside the building. The cabin's one small room was in deplorable condition. Unwashed dishes were piled in a metal basin, articles of clothing were scattered about, and dust lay everywhere. "Whew, wouldn't Aunt Gertrude fuss if she could see this mess?" Frank said to himself, chuckling. He stepped into the room and looked around for clues. At one end was a stone fireplace in which were scattered several charred logs. Flanking each side of the fireplace were numerous boat anchors of varying shapes and sizes. "This is Anchor's place, all right," thought Frank. "I can see how he got his nickname." The young detective spotted a supply of canned foods stacked on a wooden shelf above the sink. Realizing he was hungry, Frank opened a couple of cans of meat. He then took them outside and shared their contents with Joe. "Anchor brand meat, eh?" Joe grinned. "Remind me to thank that crook." Frank returned to the cabin to continue his investigation. After a thorough search, he found nothing. Frank was about to give up when something in the fireplace caught his eye. It was a charred piece of paper. Lifting it carefully out of the ashes, he placed it gently on the floor. Bending down, the young sleuth saw that it contained a list of names. The printing was extremely faint, but he could make out the names of Peterson, Anchor, and Rodax. At the bottom of the list was a skull and crossbones and the initials C.H. "C.H.," Frank repeated. Could they stand for Clint Hill? On a hunch, Frank picked up a bucket of firewood located nearby and dumped the contents on the floor. Among the wood was a crumpled fragment of paper which appeared to have been torn from a small loose-leaf diary. Frank smoothed out the paper and found written on it, "That ghost knows too much." Excited, Frank rushed outside to show Joe his discovery. Joe examined the note, then pointed to a patch of ground near the cabin. "I've made an interesting discovery of my own," he said, and led Frank to the spot. Impressed clearly in the earth was a set of footprints. The instep of the right foot was narrower than that of the left. "Clint Hill's footprints again!" Frank exclaimed. "And they appear to be quite fresh," Joe said. Frank stared at the prints. "Now, I'm convinced that Clint Hill is alive. If he was double-crossed by the gang, maybe he's plaguing them for revenge or to extort money from them in return for keeping quiet about their activities. That could be the reason why Peterson wanted us to track down the ghost," Joe replied. "Once we found Hill, he could get rid of him." "Possibly," Frank said. "Then again, we could have Hill all wrong. He could be working to bring the gang to justice in his own way." Frank took an envelope from his pocket and gently inserted the charred piece of paper he'd found. "Mac should be here soon to pick us up," he said. "We'd better get back to Bayport pronto and show this new evidence to Mr. Allen." The boys returned to the pasture. They'd waited only a few minutes when they saw the helicopter skimming over the tops of the hills. The pilot descended directly over the pasture and touched down a few yards away. The boys climbed into the cabin and the craft lifted off the ground. A brisk tailwind carried the helicopter along at a ground speed greater than that normally experienced, shortening the return flight by almost 15 minutes. Mac set the craft down on a grass-covered area near the Ace Air Service ramp, and the Hardys hurried off to telephone Mr. Allen. "I'll meet you at Peterson's office in a few minutes," he said. Minutes later, the two detectives were walking through the company hangar. They noticed that all of Stanwhite's aircraft were out except one. As the Hardys passed it, a man suddenly jumped from behind the plane and, unnoticed by the boys, lobbed a spherical-shaped metal object at them. It struck the concrete floor, bounded hard once, then rolled directly toward the brothers. "Hit the floor! Quick!" Frank shouted as he recognized the object. "That's a hand grenade!" The boys hurled themselves flat and folded their arms over their heads. A split second later, they heard an ear-shattering explosion, then the piercing whine of shrapnel flying above them. The concussion rocked the hangar. Metal fragments from the grenade tore into the wings and fuselage of the plane. The high-octane fuel gushed out of the plane's wing tanks, buckled by the blast. Half dazed, the boys scrambled to their feet. The churning dust and smoke choked them. "We'd better get out of here," Joe cried. "If that fuel catches fire, this place will go up like a torch." Outside the hangar, the Hardys glanced around to see if the man who had thrown the grenade was in sight, but he'd vanished. A small crowd had gathered, attracted by the explosion. An airport fire truck rolled into the hangar. Its crew quickly sprayed the plane and the floor with chemical foam to prevent the fuel from igniting. Just then, Mr. Allen arrived. "What happened here? What's all the commotion?" he asked. "Someone tossed a grenade at us in here," Joe answered, wiping beads of perspiration from his forehead. "The gang we're after sure plays rough," said Frank, angered. Mr. Allen's face showed his apprehension. "Things are becoming too dangerous. Maybe you boys should give up the case." "We're not quitting now," Frank declared. We have the gang worried. They're desperate and want us out of the way. This grenade business proves it." The Hardys and Mr. Allen walked together to Peterson's office. There, Frank showed the executive the names on the paper he discovered in the cabin. "This ties in with some news I have for you," Mr. Allen said. Here's a picture. There we go. "I've just learned that Rodax has suddenly resigned his job. He told the payroll master, who was the last to see him, that he had been offered a better job with another firm." "Did Rodax say where?" Frank queried. "No, only that it was a long distance from here. He collected what pay was due him and disappeared." "How about Mrs. Rodax?" Joe asked. "Has anyone questioned her?" "I telephoned his home," Mr. Allen said. "Mrs. Rodax informed me that her husband left and did not say what his destination was. He told her only that he was going on a confidential trip." "What time did Rodax leave the plant?" Frank asked. "Late this morning, according to the payroll master." "Then it's too late to try tailing him," Frank said, disappointed. "Another thing," the executive said. "One of the shipping room clerks, Joe Unger, also quit his job suddenly." Frank remarked, "He too could be working with the gang." Joe stood nearby in deep thought. "I have a hunch," he said. "It's pretty obvious they never did reach California, and no word has been received of their landing anywhere else in this country, or Canada, or Mexico." "Where do you think they are?" Mr. Allen asked with interest. "Ile de la Mer," Joe answered. "Since it's uninhabited, it would make a great hideout, and Peterson would remember the air route from the trip he and Clint Hill were making when their plane crashed at sea." Both Frank and the company president were impressed by Joe's theory. "It's worth looking into," Frank exclaimed, and turned to Mr. Allen. "Could you arrange for Joe and me to go there?" "I certainly can," Mr. Allen said, "but not without protection. I'm going to assign a husky bodyguard to accompany you." Chapter 18. Air Chart Secret. Elated at the prospect of the trip, the brothers hurried home to discuss the island hop with Mr. Hardy. The ace detective was apprehensive, especially after hearing about the grenade incident. He agreed, however, that a search of Ile de la Mer would certainly be worthwhile. "I'd like to make the trip with you," their father said, "but there are too many loose ends in the case to be taken care of here." His expression became grave. "Be on your guard," he warned his sons. "This is a clever gang we're up against." The Hardys were just finishing dinner when Mr. Allen telephoned. I've obtained the use of a twin-engine amphibian aircraft to take you boys to Ile de la Mer. Jerry Madden will be your pilot, the executive announced. I've also managed to get 2 big strapping fellows from the plant to go along. Great, Frank answered. And thanks, we'll need only a day to get ready. Keep me posted on developments, said Mr. Allen, and good luck. Only a few minutes passed before the telephone rang again. Hello, said Frank. This is the ghost of Clint Hill, an eerie voice announced. I warn you, dead men tell no tales. Frank gripped the phone tighter. Who is this? There was a moment of silence, then a loud burst of laughter. Chet, Frank exclaimed. You had me fooled. You're speaking to a master impersonator, Chet boasted. Suddenly, Frank was struck with an idea. Listen, pal, your ghost imitation may come in handy. How'd you like to fly down to Ile de la Mer with Joe and me? Count me in, Chet responded excitedly. Just make sure there's enough food on board. The next day, the brothers went to the Morton farmhouse to give Chet more details concerning the trip. They found Iola Morton, Chet's pretty dark-haired sister, and Callie Shaw, an attractive blonde, seated in the living room. Callie was Frank's favorite date, while Joe liked Iola very much. Standing in the middle of the room was Chet. He was whistling High Journey. Hi, fellows, he called, interrupting his performance long enough to take several bites out of the massive sandwich he was holding. Hi, Frank and Joe grinned as they took seats near the 2 girls. As you can see, Iola said with a smile, Chet is possibly one of the best-fed ghosts in the business. I need all the energy I can get, Chet defended himself. I might even start my own ghost-to-ghost network. By this time, he'd finished his sandwich and hurried to the kitchen. Seconds later, he reappeared holding a large roasted turkey leg. Using it as a baton to mark the tempo, he resumed whistling. What if the real ghost gets mad at you for imitating him and decides to haunt you? Said Joe, chuckling. Chet stopped whistling. He paled slightly. Oh, come on, fellas, he quavered. You don't think Clint Hill is a real ghost, do you? We can't say for sure, Frank answered, trying to act solemn. After all, we've never seen him. We've only heard him speak. Chet suddenly found his turkey leg unappetizing. He laid it down on a plate. The girls began giggling. This is no laughing matter, he said with a frown. But suddenly his expression brightened. I know what I'll do if Hill is a ghost. If he tries to scare us, I'll scare him right back. Chet dashed from the room. Moments later he reappeared, his stout form draped in a white sheet. The others roared with laughter as Chet leaped playfully about the room with the sheet swirling behind him. Better watch where you're going, Frank warned the cavorting phantom. Chet now spread his arms wide under the sheet, looking like a huge white bat. He took a high running jump across the room. Coming down hard, he tripped on one corner of the sheet. Chet lost his balance, stumbled, then fell and rolled across the room in a tangled mass of cloth. The girls joined in the Hardys' fresh outburst of laughter. What's so funny? Chet groaned as he struggled to free himself. I thought I looked pretty scared. If Clint Hill's ghost ever saw you in that get-up, Frank said, he'd laugh so hard he wouldn't be able to haunt anyone. Chet finally extricated himself and plunked down into a chair with a disgruntled expression. Just then Mrs. Morton appeared and invited everyone to have lunch. As they all ate, the 3 boys discussed the trip to Ile de la Mer. Oh, I wish I were going, Iola said wistfully. A little later, Chet accompanied the Hardys to the airport so they might check the plans for the trip. As they approached the Stanwide hangar, the boys spotted a twin-engined amphibian aircraft parked on the macadam ramp in front of the building. As they walked up to the craft, Jerry Madden's head suddenly popped from a window in the cockpit. Hello, fellows, he called. How do you like her? A beauty, Joe responded, as they all admired the craft's graceful lines and bright painted surfaces. Jerry's head vanished into the cockpit. A moment later, a door opened in the side of the fuselage, and he reappeared. We just finished installing the long-range tanks, Jerry announced. As it stands now, we can make Ile de la Mer non-stop and still have a couple of hours' fuel in reserve. What about the return flight? Frank asked. "Won't we have to refuel?" "According to Mr. Allen," Jerry explained, "the exploratory team he sent to the island took a sizable supply of aviation gasoline with them. It was stored in 55-gallon drums. Some of them may have been unloaded and might still be there. However, if we find it's gone or unusable, the company will have more fuel flown down to us." After finding that everyone was in readiness, Frank said he thought they should plan to depart as soon as practicable. "Tonight, maybe?" "Okay," Jerry replied. "I'll give the plane a final check, then see what the Weather Bureau will give us in the way of a route forecast. It would be good to leave tonight, then we'd arrive at the island after sunrise tomorrow." The boys hurried off to make final preparations. The Hardys dropped Chet at his house, telling him they would return within a couple of hours. After arriving at their own house, Frank and Joe learned that their father had gone out of town. Mrs. Hardy and Aunt Gertrude began preparing a substantial supper for the boys while they packed some light luggage. The two women tried hard to conceal their apprehension, but it showed on their faces. The boys assured them everything would be all right. Finally, they departed for the airport, picking up Chet on the way. As they walked toward the stand-wide hangar, the boys spotted Jerry Madden standing near the airplane. There were two men with him, tall, muscular fellows who appeared to be in their late 20s. The pilot introduced them as Bill Vogel and Kurt Lerner, the men Mr. Allen had selected to go on the trip. Bill and Kurt greeted the boys with hard, firm handshakes. "Wow," Chet whispered as he straightened out the fingers of his right hand. "I'm glad those two were on our side." Soon everyone was aboard the amphibian, and the engines were started. "How's the weather forecast?" Frank asked. Jerry asked Jerry as they waited for the motors to warm up. "Excellent," Jerry replied. "However, there is a strong low-pressure system situated southwest of Ile-de-la-Mer. It could develop into quite a storm center. Right now it's hard to say in just what direction it may move, but at present it shouldn't give us any trouble." He told the boys that once out of the continental United States, he would have to ask for Defense Visual Flight Regulation. After scanning the instrument panel methodically, Jerry picked up the microphone and communicated with Bayport Tower. He asked for taxi and takeoff instructions and requested that his DVFR flight plane be activated. Upon lining up the craft on the active runway to which he was cleared, Jerry eased the throttles ahead to maximum power. After a short run, the plane lifted off the ground easily. Jerry pulled up a small lever which retracted the wheels into the fuselage. When he reached the selected cruising altitude, Jerry set the plane on course. Hour after hour passed as it bore through the sky. Lulled by the drone of the engines, the boys caught up on some sleep. When they awoke, the first light of dawn was breaking in the east. Gradually, the light grew brighter, revealing a fascinating mosaic of deep blue and jade green on the surface of the ocean below. "How long have we been flying over water?" Frank asked. "Quite some time," Jerry replied. "We left the United States coast about 3 hours ago." "You must be really tired," Frank said. "Not really," Jerry responded. "I slept most of yesterday. Also, the automatic pilot gives me a chance to stretch my arms and legs once in a while." Chet had wasted no time looking into the food supplies for breakfast. The meal, consisting mostly of fresh fruit, was divided among the group. "We must be getting close to Ile-de-la-Mer," Jerry told the boys. He examined his chart closely. "Of course, I'm basing that on dead reckoning, which is not always as precise as we'd like it to be. But do you see those cumulus clouds ahead?" The boys nodded. "Clouds like that generally form over patches of land, such as an island," Jerry said. He maintained his course. Gradually, the irregular outline of a small island loomed on the horizon. "That's Ile-de-la-Mer," Jerry exclaimed. "I've seen aerial shots of it that Clint Hill sent to Mr. Allen. It has a particular wedge-like shape, which is unmistakable." He eased the nose of the plane down and descended to a lower altitude. Then Jerry aimed at the island and approached it at treetop height. Zooming in over the rocky coast, he pulled the nose of the plane sharply upward and followed the contour of the hills inland. "There doesn't appear to be any level terrain to land on," he observed. "Nothing suitable along the coast?" Frank asked. "Much too rocky," Jerry responded. "We'll have to make a water landing." The pilot searched the coastline for a cove or inlet that would shelter the plane from the rougher waters of the open sea. Finally, he spotted a small cove on the south side of the island. Carefully studying the surface conditions, Jerry approached the cove and flared out several feet above the water. He now eased the throttles back and let the hull of the plane settle into the water. Taxiing into the cove, he called for the anchors to be heaved, then shut off the engines. "The island looks deserted," Joe commented. "Just the same, we better be careful," Frank warned. "Members of the gang could be in hiding somewhere." Jerry assured himself that the aircraft was secured firmly. Then he inflated a large rubber raft to take the group to shore. "I'm sure I can find the old campsite of the exploratory team," Jerry said. "Mr. Allen described it to me in detail." The Hardys, Chet, Kurt Lerner, and Bill Vogel followed the pilot through the thick trees and brush. Luckily, it wasn't long before the group broke out into a clearing. There they found a small wooden shack, various pieces of machinery, and a number of 55-gallon drums marked aviation gasoline. Chet and Jerry examined the fuel supply while the Hardys, accompanied by Bill and Kurt, went into the shack. They found it to be in good condition, and cans of food were stored on shelves along one wall. By the looks of things here," Frank observed, "I'd say this place has been occupied recently." The boys scrutinized the interior closely for clues to the occupant, but saw nothing unusual. Then Joe noticed something white sticking out behind a row of cans on the top shelf. He reached up and pulled down 2 large folded sheets of paper. As he unfolded them, his eyes widened with excitement. "Frank," he exclaimed, "take a look at this." Joe pointed to his discovery. "Planning charts for aerial navigation, and here are course lines drawn on them." Frank dashed outside to summon Jerry and Chet. The pilot examined the charts with avid interest. "The course lines start at the exact latitude and longitude of this island," Jerry declared. He traced the line with his finger. It ran off the first chart and continued on the second. The course led back into the United States to the approximate location of the camouflaged cave the Hardys had discovered. From there, it went to a point in a sparsely settled region of Montana. "How do you figure this mystery?" Jerry asked. Frank answered, "The gang must have been operating between the cave and this island. After we discovered the cave and things got hot for them, they decided to establish a new hideout in Montana." "Let's go there," Joe exclaimed. Even Chet was enthusiastic about the idea. "Maybe I'll still get a chance to play ghost." "Can the plane make it to Montana nonstop?" Joe questioned. "Well, with full fuel tanks and favorable winds, we can make it at least most of the way," the pilot replied. "We may have to stop once to refuel." Suddenly, they all became aware that a strong wind was building up. Jerry ran out of the shack and scanned the sky. A dark, threatening layer of clouds was moving toward the island. "That storm center I told you about," he shouted to the others. "It has started moving, and it's coming right across this place." The storm now seemed to be approaching with increasing speed. The winds grew stronger, and intermittent droplets of rain began to pelt the area. "Quick," Jerry ordered. "Let's get back to the plane. Those anchors won't hold in a big storm." Followed by the Hardys, Chet, and the 2 Stanwide men, he ran off into the brush and back along the path over which they'd come. The wind became more violent, and the rain was falling steadily. It quickly increased to a heavy downpour which stung the faces of the boys and their companions. Reaching the cove, the group leaped into the raft and started paddling toward the plane, which was already being tossed around like a cork. Despite all their efforts, progress was slow. Each stroke of the paddles took the raft only a few inches ahead. Finally, they managed to reach the plane. Jumping onto it from a raft was a precarious operation. The craft rolled and pitched violently under the pounding of the waves. The Hardys glanced at the anchor ropes anxiously. They were being strained taut. "Those ropes will snap at any minute," Frank thought fearfully. Tune in soon for the next chapter.